August 14, 2005, in the skies above Athens, the capital of Greece, two F-16 fighter jets were urgently dispatched to intercept a Boeing 737 passenger plane. When the pilots of the fighter jets approached and looked through the windows, they were chilled to the bone by what they saw. Every passenger was wearing an oxygen mask and sitting motionless in their seats. Inside the cockpit, the captain was completely missing. Instead, there was a mysterious person trying to control the aircraft. What had happened on that flight? Who was the mysterious figure in the cockpit? Hello, I'm Tri. In this video, I will tell you about a tragic incident in aviation history, a story of human error, and the struggle between life and death. Mayday, a passenger plane in distress. Over the clear blue waters of the Mediterranean lies a small gem-like island, the Republic of Cyprus. Thanks to its favorable Mediterranean climate, the island is always bathed in warm sunlight and gentle sea breezes. Every summer, tourists from all over Europe flock here to relax and enjoy their vacations. Because of this, Helios Airways was established, specializing in charter flights catering to tourism. As demand surged, in 2004, the airline added a second Boeing 737 to its fleet. However, this 737-300 was an old aircraft leased from Germany, and ever since entering service, it had been plagued with malfunctions. In December 2004, while flying, the plane suddenly suffered a severe loss of pressure due to a faulty rear right door seal. Cabin pressure blew the door open, creating a gaping hole. After the incident, the aircraft underwent major repairs. However, it still resembled an old car that could never be completely fixed. Sometimes the electronic cooling system malfunctioned. Other times, the pressurization system failed. The aircraft spent more time in maintenance than it did flying in the sky. On the night before the accident, this aircraft operated a charter flight from Larnaca to Cyprus. Shortly after takeoff, the crew heard a loud bang coming from the rear right door. At the same time, the door seal appeared to be frozen. Despite this, the plane landed safely in Cyprus at dawn on August 14th. Immediately after landing, the captain requested a full inspection of the aircraft by technicians. The person assigned to this task was Helios's chief engineer, Mr. Alan Owen. He was a British engineer who had worked for many major airlines and was very familiar with this aircraft. Owen immediately stated that the issue still lay with the seal on the rear right door. He gathered the technical team and began performing a ground pressurization test. According to the instructions in the technical manual, normally, during flight, the cabin pressure is automatically adjusted based on altitude to keep passengers in a simulated low-altitude environment. That makes breathing easier. Right after takeoff, the plane starts compressing air into the cabin to simulate this process without starting the main engines. The technicians turned on the APU, which is the auxiliary power unit, to provide compressed air for the air conditioning and pressurization systems. Then they closed the outflow valve and set the control knob on the pressurization panel to manual mode. By doing this, the aircraft could simulate a high-pressure environment, as if it were flying at high altitude, even while still on the ground. About half an hour later, the pressure difference between inside and outside the cabin had risen to 8.25 psi, equal to 56.9 kilopascals. The two engineers working outside the aircraft did not hear any leakage sounds from the rear right door. Chief Engineer Alan Owen concluded that the aircraft's pressurization system had no issues. In the maintenance log, he clearly wrote, "No defects found, no leaks, no unusual sounds." The aircraft passed inspection. However, after completing the inspection procedure, they forgot to turn the pressurization knob from manual mode back to automatic. A seemingly harmless minor oversight was about to seal the fate of 121 people on board. Around 8 a.m., 2 pilots and 4 flight attendants boarded the aircraft to prepare for the flight. According to the schedule, flight number Helios 522 was set to fly from Cyprus to Athens, Greece, then continue on to Prague, the capital of the Czech Republic. Seated in the cockpit were 2 veteran pilots, Captain Hans-Jürgen Merten, 58 years old, and First Officer Pampos Karalambis, aged 51. Together they had over 23,000 flight hours. Because several flight attendants had called in sick that day, the airline had to call in someone from vacation. Andreas Prodromo, Initially, Andreas didn't want to come in. But since his girlfriend, Harris Carolambus, was also a flight attendant on that flight, he agreed to join. Andreas was an experienced flight attendant and also held a private pilot license. As 115 passengers gradually boarded the aircraft, the two pilots were still completing their cockpit preparations. They needed to check the switches on the panel in the proper sequence, from left to right, top to bottom, to ensure all systems were functioning correctly. One of the critical steps in the checklist was to rotate the knob and set the pressurization mode back to automatic. However, since the flight was already delayed, by the time passengers began boarding, the two pilots tried to rush the preparations to the point that no one noticed. The pressurization knob was still set to manual instead of automatic mode as the checklist required. If they had followed the checklist thoroughly, such a serious mistake would have been nearly impossible to miss. But it seemed they were operating on autopilot, just skimming through the checklist, without actually verifying the state of each system. It's also possible they didn't even complete the checklist properly. A procedure that was supposed to be a safety shield for the flight was reduced to a mere formality. At 8:07 a.m., the Helios 522 flight began. Moments later, the Boeing 737, with a yellow sun god symbol on its tail, soared into the sky like Helios' chariot. In Greek mythology, 5 minutes after takeoff, it reached an altitude of 3,048 meters, 10,000 feet. The flight was cleared to continue climbing to a cruising altitude of 10,363 meters, or 34,000 feet. Inside the cabin, passengers were happily enjoying the ocean view and the island of Cyprus through the windows, without realizing why their hands began to ache and felt a pressure-like sensation in their ears, because at that moment, the cabin was completely unpressurized. The air was thinning as the altitude increased. In the cockpit, a green light indicated that manual pressurization was still on, continuously warning the pilots of a critical issue they had overlooked, but no one noticed. The cabin pressure gauge clearly showed that the cabin altitude kept increasing. Yet when the pilots conducted the after-takeoff checks and climb checklist, they still didn't catch this critical issue. The plane kept climbing. A disaster that was entirely preventable was now unfolding. At an altitude of 3,810 meters, 12,500 feet, the cabin altitude exceeded 3,048 meters, 10,000 feet, surpassing the safety limit for passengers. Immediately, the cabin altitude warning alarm blared loudly in the cockpit. The sound of this alarm was identical to the takeoff configuration warning, which only activates when the aircraft is still on the ground and not properly set up for takeoff. However, Captain Hans mistook the cabin altitude warning for a takeoff configuration warning. Neither he nor the first officer wore oxygen masks, nor did they check the pressurization control, which was still set to manual mode. Instead, the captain proceeded to disengage the autopilot, then re-engaged it, then turned off the auto throttle, GA mode, and reduced engine thrust. All of these were standard responses to a takeoff configuration warning, but completely meaningless in the case of cabin depressurization. Meanwhile, the aircraft continued to climb. The electronic equipment bay cooling system began to alert because it was no longer receiving enough airflow, a clear indication that air pressure throughout the cabin had dropped dangerously low. Yet Captain Hans still didn't realize that the aircraft was experiencing depressurization. He attempted to contact ground engineering support to ask for help. The person he reached was Engineer Alan Owen, the one who had forgotten to reset the pressurization knob to automatic. Due to the captain's poor English, he meant to say 2 warning lights were on, but mistakenly said the 2 warning lights for cooling were off. Upon hearing that, Alan was completely confused about why the captain was worried about lights that were supposed to be off under normal conditions. Owen replied that this was perfectly normal. While the two were speaking, the aircraft had already climbed to 4,267 meters, 14,000 feet. At that moment, the cabin crew oxygen system warning light turned on. Immediately, all passenger oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. These masks only supply about just enough to give passengers time to breathe, while the aircraft performs an emergency descent to a safe altitude. However, the 2 pilots in the cockpit completely failed to recognize that this series of warnings indicated cabin depressurization. They continued letting the plane climb, focused solely on resolving the cooling issue, unaware that they were slowly suffocating. At this point, Alan Owen began to feel suspicious. Could it be that the captain mistook the manual pressurization light for the equipment cooling system warning? Can you please confirm for me whether the pressurization knob has been set back to automatic? At that point, he was already suffering from severe hypoxia and didn't answer the question correctly, but asked instead, where is the circuit breaker for the cooling system? At this moment, flight Helios 522 had reached an altitude of 8,839 meters, 29,000 feet, nearly as high. In the sudden low oxygen conditions at such altitude, an untrained person would quickly lose consciousness. Captain Hans attempted to stand, leaving his seat to find the circuit breaker, but as soon as he stood up, he collapsed in the cockpit due to oxygen deprivation, and never woke up again. Just a few minutes later, First Officer Pampos also lost consciousness in his seat. Meanwhile, the aircraft with flight number Helios 522 continued flying silently as the aircraft reached 10,300. With no one at the controls, the Boeing 737 still quietly obeyed instructions from the autopilot system, continuing to cruise through the silent skies at cruising altitude. The oxygen supply from the emergency masks had run out. In the passenger cabin, temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Under extreme hypoxia and freezing conditions, passengers gradually fell into unconsciousness. Unless the two pilots miraculously regained consciousness, the fate awaiting them would only be eternal darkness. In the previous part, we learned that due to pilot error, the cabin pressurization system was never activated. The plane was flying at over 10,000 meters without oxygen. Both pilots suffered from severe oxygen deprivation and eventually passed out in the cockpit. An aircraft with no one in control, a ghost flight. Where would Helios 522 eventually end up? In this moment of life and death, was there still any miracle that could save the 121 people now unconscious on the aircraft? Hello, I'm Tri. In this episode, I will continue recounting the full story of the tragedy of Helios Airways Flight 522, 8:36 a.m. local time. Flight Helios 522 had been out of contact for 16 minutes when it entered Greek airspace. It had just flown past the VOR station of Rhodes Island, then made a right turn exactly along the route that had been pre-programmed. Greek air traffic controllers and nearby aircraft repeatedly called on radio frequencies, trying to establish contact with Helios 522. But each time, all they received in return was complete silence. On the radar screen, the Boeing 737 was still clearly visible at the correct altitude, on course, and at the correct speed. Controllers assumed that perhaps the aircraft was experiencing a radio malfunction. 9:26. Instead of descending as expected, the aircraft maintained its altitude of 10,363 meters. Suddenly, it began executing an approach procedure exactly following the landing chart that had been preloaded by the pilot for Athens Airport. At that point, the Greek controllers were stunned. This couldn't just be a radio failure. Something extremely abnormal was happening. They immediately alerted the Greek Air Force. Two F-16 fighter jets were scrambled on an emergency mission to intercept Flight 522. Meanwhile, the aircraft turned right and headed straight for runway 03L left at Athens International Airport. Just a few minutes later, it flew directly over the airport at cruising altitude, and then suddenly turned back toward the VOR navigation point on Kia. The controller suddenly realized that the recent flight path was exactly the route used for the standard go-around for runway 03L. But it didn't stop there. The aircraft continued to perform the procedure for entering a holding pattern, and began circling in the skies above Kia Island. Everyone tracked from the ground was in shock. Helios Flight 522 was not responding to any call whatsoever. It kept flying like a ghost, repeating each step of the flight plan exactly, as if it were being controlled by someone. But in reality, no one was responding from inside. 10:23. The plane had completed 6 loops over Kia Island. Finally, 2 Greek Air Force F-16s caught up with the ghost plane. One of the F-16 pilots signaled the 737 to follow, but the Boeing showed no response whatsoever. The fighter jets flew closer to inspect the exterior. There were no signs of damage to the plane. Landing gear, engines, wings, everything looked intact. One of the F-16 pilots flew even closer to take a clear look through the windows. What he saw inside was something he would never forget. The cabin was dimly lit. Oxygen masks were hanging from the ceiling. Passengers sat motionless, slumped in their seats. No one showed any signs of life. When the F-16 pilot turned his gaze to the cockpit, he saw something even more unbelievable. The first officer was slumped in his seat, and the captain was nowhere to be seen in the cockpit. There was no one in the left-hand seat. When ground control received the F-16 pilot's report, they finally understood the situation. Helios Flight 522 had suffered a serious emergency. Now, this Boeing 737 was nothing more than a ghost plane, circling at over 10,000 meters altitude. It would only fly until its fuel ran out, and then crash to the ground. Since no one could predict where it would fall, the entire Athens region was immediately placed on high alert. When the aircraft began its 10th loop, something occurred that shocked everyone. The F-16 pilot suddenly saw someone staggering into the cockpit, sitting in the captain's seat and putting on an oxygen mask. Who was that person? Could it be a hijacker? The fighter pilot immediately signaled, trying to get his attention from the man in the cockpit, but he showed no response at all. Can you describe what that person is wearing? Is he in uniform? He's wearing a vest and a blue shirt, so he's not in a crew uniform. Upon hearing the description, the ground personnel immediately realized the person in the cockpit was Andreas Prodromo, the only male flight attendant on board, who held a private pilot license, but had never been trained to fly a Boeing 737. Before he had time to get familiar with the cockpit, the left engine shut down due to fuel exhaustion. Fortunately, Andreas had some knowledge of how to use the autopilot system. He tried to activate the descent. The F-16 pilot continued signaling, but Andreas couldn't respond. He was fully focused on flying the aircraft, which was in a critical situation. In a state of hypoxia, Andreas desperately called out, "Mayday," over the radio, but the plane's radio frequency was still tuned to Cyprus air traffic control. No one in Greece could hear his distress call. When the plane descended to 3,352 meters, 11,000 feet, Andreas disabled the autopilot and tried with all his strength to control the aircraft, with only one engine remaining. However, with a mid-size aircraft like the Boeing 737, that was too much for someone with only a private pilot license. As the plane descended to 2,133 meters, 7,000 feet, the right engine also ran out of fuel. The aircraft officially ran dry and could now only glide in the air. The F-16 pilot tried to get even closer, hoping to gain his attention. This time, Andreas saw them. The man in the cockpit saw me. I gave a navigation signal, but he didn't respond. I'm sure he saw me. The fighter pilot used hand signals to direct Andreas to follow him and turn toward the airport, but Andreas could only weakly raise his left hand, pointing downward as if to say, "We can't save them anymore." At that point, the plane was only at 762 meters, 2,500 feet, flying extremely low over the ground. The plane was descending rapidly. It was about to crash. In the final moments of Helios Flight 522, Andreas saw the altitude dropping fast. In his last seconds, he deliberately steered to avoid the residential areas below. The plane veered left toward a remote mountain area where no one lived. The Boeing 737 continued gliding downward, plummeting toward the ground. The fighter pilots were now powerless. They could only watch the civilian plane slowly descend, unable to do anything to save Andreas. With his last ounce of strength, he tried pulling the control column to reduce the crash speed, but with no engines remaining, the aircraft had lost all powered flight capability. 11:03 a.m. Exactly 2 hours after takeoff, Helios Airways Flight 522 crashed into the mountains of Gramatiko, 32 kilometers northeast of Athens. Mayday, 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 civilian plane crash. Mayday, 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 civilian plane crash. The violent impact sparked a massive forest fire. The aircraft was torn apart, debris scattered across 2 hills and a valley below. The tail section was the only part that remained recognizable. The Helios sun god emblem on the tail appeared to tilt downward, as if silently watching the burning mountains below. All 121 people on board perished. 1 year after the tragedy, the Hellenic Civil Aviation Authority released the final on the accident, Helios 522. Besides engineer Alan Owen's mistake of forgetting to reset the pressurization knob to auto mode, the report revealed even more heartbreaking truths. Although Alan made the initial error, he wasn't the only one, nor was he solely responsible. Throughout the entire flight, the pilots had at least 3 clear chances to notice the pressurization knob was in the wrong mode, but they overlooked it. This indicates that the safety checklist, designed to ensure flight safety, was completely ineffective. Of doom. Also in the report, it was revealed that Captain Hans-Jürgen Merten mistook the cabin pressure warning for a takeoff configuration alarm, which suggests he did not fully understand the aircraft's systems, despite his extensive experience. In fact, he had been dismissed by UK-based Jet2 for procedural violations before joining Helios Airways. As for First Officer Pampos Karalambis, he had been repeatedly warned for frequently cutting corners during pre-flight checks. Beyond individual errors, the report also exposed systemic issues. The operating culture of Helios Airways focused on maximizing aircraft and crew efficiency at all costs, even if that meant pushing safety limits. Sadly, this model persisted for years, in part because Cyprus lacked an effective aviation oversight system and delegated flight safety supervision to the UK Civil Aviation Authority, an agency with no real power over the airline. In such an environment, Helios Airways became a ticking time bomb, and disaster was only a matter of time. After all this, one lingering question remains. According to Post 9/11 aviation rules, cockpit doors must remain locked at all times, and only the lead flight attendant knows the emergency code. On that flight, the code holder was Chief Flight Attendant Lucia Viterli, and she most likely passed out due to lack of oxygen. Andreas had to obtain the code from her before he could enter the cockpit. The investigation found that 4 portable oxygen bottles had been used, but it remains uncertain. Did Andreas use it alone, or did he try to help fellow crew members or passengers? Whatever the case, even with oxygen, time and fate were not on their side. Prolonged oxygen deprivation undoubtedly impaired human cognition and ability to act. It's possible that Andreas spent much precious time trying to wake up unconscious colleagues and searching for a long while before he could find the cockpit code. All of these factors may have left him able to enter the cockpit only at the last minute, when every chance of saving the flight had nearly closed. Though Andreas could not become a hero, like in a Hollywood movie, to save Flight 522, he still fought in an almost impossible mission. Because a hero is not defined by success, but by the choice not to give up, Andreas used his own life to fulfill the final duty of a flight attendant. In a life-or-death moment at over 33,000 feet, he defined, through action, the meaning of duty and courage. Let us bow our heads in remembrance of all 121 victims aboard Helios Flight 522 and offer our deepest condolences to the families of the deceased.